We are going to record this webinar this evening, and tomorrow I will send you the recording as well as the slide presentation. But I've also put the slide presentation in the chat if you want to download it and have it tonight. Finally, I'll just say a few words about MEFA. If you're not super familiar with MEFA, MEFA is a not-for-profit state authority here in Massachusetts. And we were started in 1982 to help families plan, save, and pay for college. We have the state's savings plans for college and other, and we also have low-cost loans for families who need that type of financing to help pay for college. And then the other things we do are no matter what stage your students are at, what grade, what age, we provide guidance to you about planning, saving, and paying for college. And so this is a big piece of the guidance we like to provide, which is all about college financing, the financial aid process, very important. And this usually takes place when families have a senior in high school. But if any of you have younger students, that's great that you're getting a jump on this. With that, Gail, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we'll enjoy the evening.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Julie. It is a pleasure to be with you. It's always a little bit nicer to be standing in front of you and kind of see all your bright faces, but I also appreciate that it's the end of a long workday probably. And so I do hope that you're enjoying this in the comfort of your homes, maybe on your couch. So we do kind of bring financial aid to a new level. It is a complex subject and topic. And at times it can feel a little bit intrusive. So what I love about our partnership and being in financial aid for so long is really trying to break down and really empower families to be able to tackle this and achieve a financing plan that's going to work for you and your family, and really give your child the gift of continuing education for the rest of their life. So our topics tonight are to talk about financial aid, introduce you to them if you're not already familiar, talk a little bit about the sources and where the financial aid comes from. We'll talk about the important application process and getting a handle and tackle on that. What I think is the most important, kind of how decisions are made so that you can feel empowered, so that you can know a little bit more about what questions to ask. And then I find that there's so much material here that by the time we get to about an hour, there's not a whole lot of time to talk about paying for college, but we are at the stage where the first three pieces are the most important. There will be time in the future to talk about the paying piece and other resources, but I want to make sure that you get out tonight questions and that you have about this process and at least feel a good introduction. So let's start with the types and sources of financial aid. So financial aid, of course, are the resources that help pay for college. There's no single bullet, there's no one source, but what is nice is that our job as financial aid administrators is to kind of put together as much as we can for families and then work with families on a financing plan together. So of course, grants and scholarships, sometimes those terms are used interchangeably, and we'll talk about that as well as some of the distinctions. That is gift aid or free money. We will also talk about federal work study. Now, this is a resource and considered financial aid because students work during the academic year and they use the earnings that they get directly. They're not going to credit the bill or the student's account, but they're going to get that money directly to then be able to use toward their expenses. For students today, that's usually their personal expenses, and we'll get a little bit more into that. And then federal student loans are a form of financial aid because they're open to all students, and we'll talk about some of the details, but because there's no credit check, it is not a consumer-based loan, It's a vehicle, it's a low cost vehicle, and it's also a vehicle that has some favorable terms should circumstances change. So loans are considered financial aid as well. So we're going to talk tonight about all of those things. And all of those specific types of financial aid come from a variety of sources. So this is where we're it takes a village, as they say, and it certainly takes a lot of financial aid to afford higher education. So these sources are all really important. The first is the federal source, and the federal government offers financial aid in the form of that free money, the gifts. There's federal work study, and there are federal loans. There are also tax incentives, which would be money that you would get back at the end of the tax year. States, and specifically Massachusetts, also offer financial aid in the form of grants and gift money, scholarships, tuition waivers at our state institutions, and Massachusetts has a no interest loan program that some institutions participate with. Colleges and universities offer a tremendous amount of financial aid, and those also can come in the forms of grants, scholarship, loans, and also sometimes student employment as well at some institutions. And then other agencies would be private agencies. So there's a considerable amount of money that's given away to students from nonprofit agencies, and those are usually scholarships. Sometimes those can also be non-interest bearing loans. So as an example, in Western Massachusetts, there happens to be the Community Foundation of Western Massachusetts, and that's a clearinghouse of scholarships and loans. So if we'll start with the student loan, and we don't, the reason we start with the student loan is that because student loans are a vehicle open to any student who's in higher education. So regardless of financial need, but we'll talk about that. And in this case, the student is the sole borrower. So there may be question about whether you would lend your child significant amounts of money based on where they are today. They have not yet had a chance to build up their credit history and demonstrate that they understand the responsibility of having to repay loans and take on that responsibility. But there's no credit check. The difference between the subsidized and the unsubsidized loan is that need determination. So if a federal student loan is subsidized, then the taxpayers are paying the interest on behalf of the student. And if it's unsubsidized, that means that interest is accruing, and that is the responsibility of the student borrower throughout their enrollment and then when they go into repayment. Now, these loans are, we want to set students up for success. And so there are annual limits for these loans based on the student's class year. So as students move through their progression in college, they are, able to demonstrate that they are making progress toward their degree, and that comes with it some additional availability of federal dollars. The interest rate on these loans are set annually. So the interest rate for this current academic year is 3.73%, a reasonable amount, certainly much better than most consumer lending. And it gets set usually in about June. So you'll look at that time for what the rates might be for next year in 22-23 academic year. But that rate is fixed for the life of that loan. Students typically will pay back that money over a 10-year period after they leave their education. So they need to be enrolled at least half time, and they need to be in a degree granting program, but there are options for repayment. And so that is the flexibility that's offered with these loan options. And so one thing to kind of get a gauge, I'll try to throw in different tips along the way here tonight. But one thing is to kind of take a look at what percentage of students at a school are borrowing loans, and that might give you sort of a flavor for the financial aid investment that an institution is able to provide to students. Now, as we start to get into that free money and the gift money that everybody wants as much of as possible, we will first touch on merit-based aid. So merit-based aid, as the name implies, is awarded in recognition of achievement and merit, but it can come in different forms. So the first form that you most oftenly would think about would be an academic component. But there certainly are schools that have a mission to enroll students with artistic talent or athletic talent or leadership talent. So merit-based aid can be offered in a variety of ways. And what's important here is just to know, as you start and as you're looking at institutions broadly, it's really important to know what kind of aid any individual institution is offering, so that you can be, well positioned to ask the appropriate questions and also, follow the appropriate procedures and protocols. So merit-based aid could be, the application could be part of the admission application. Sometimes the application is earlier than the admission application. Merit-based aid is not offered at every single institution. Some institutions only offer need-based financial aid, which we'll touch on next. Sometimes there's a separate application, sometimes there's not. In all cases, really paying attention to due dates and deadlines is very important. And I would start looking into that, soon, because some of those due dates for merit applications, merit-based aid, could be as early as November. The other thing is that, they'll usually come with requirements. So you want to know what the requirements are. Are there academic requirements, or are there requirements that a student continue to participate if it's an athletic scholarship, or be in some other, segment of the school and their practices. The other form of gift money, and this is usually more prevalent, would be need-based financial aid. So this is where institutions are deciding how to allocate their financial aid dollars based on a family's demonstrated need. And we're going to talk about how that demonstrated need is determined, because it's not, unfortunately, what you demonstrate in terms of what you would like for financial aid. But what it's about a formulaic approach to allocating the resources that an institution has as equitably as possible across what could be a very wide spectrum of socioeconomic health of families and those circumstances. So need-based aid will include the grants and the loans and work study. And so if an institution is awarding financial aid to meet financial need, they may be using those components, and I'll show you how that works. But most financial aid is need-based, because the whole point of financial aid is to really assist those who do not have the financial capability to meet the educational cost. Institutions as a recruitment tool have moved further and further into merit-based aid. As costs have increased, they have leveraged their resources to try to entice and encourage a certain population of students at any given institution to come to their institution. So it really is, merit-based aid is typically more of a recruitment tool. And so what you're typically going to see is at the most selective institutions, you're going to see more and more need-based aid, and then you're going to see more merit-based aid at institutions, kind of in the middle. But even with need-based financial aid, you do need to be demonstrating academic progress. So anytime an investment is being made in your students, whether it's from the federal government or whether it's from an institution, they want to see that students are making progress toward their degree, that they're completing credits and they're achieving a grade point average that sets them on track to get that degree. So we're going to jump into the application process now and talk about the timeline. I would say the challenge here is that the deadlines and materials can be different at each college. You will probably see some themes, but it is important to check the college's website at each individual college for their deadlines and their applications. The process for financial aid really is concurrent to the admission process. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to wait for an admission decision and then apply for financial aid. Because these things are happening concurrently, usually most institutions are striving to offer financial aid offers at the same time that they're offering an admission offer, because that's the best way to really entice and celebrate that student's achievement and offer them kind of the full picture. So many of those deadlines are going to occur in January and February for a regular decision timeline. Now, submitting applications on time is important. We're going to start as early as we can because we have so many applications to consider. We're going to start as early as we can, and we're going to start determining eligibility, and we're going to start awarding students. And so there's not this idea that we're going to hold back money for late applications. So as long as you get the application in by the due date, that should be enough. So I wouldn't say that you have to have your application filed on the first day it's available, but definitely try to meet the due dates. And if you've got a reason that you can't, definitely be in touch with that school. What's really great is one of the resources, MEFA has a lot of resources available, which is why I love partnering with them to offer these sessions. But one of their resources is an application manager, and that really does, helping to stay organized is a good use of your time, and it's a good use of staying on track. And keeping some of those materials will help you to be responsive to schools if they need to ask you questions along the way. So the first piece of the application is the federal form, and this is the free application for federal student aid. It is required by all colleges that are distributing federal resources, and it is becoming available for this year, just around the corner. In about another week on October 1st. So again, you do not need to file it on October 1st, but you do want to start thinking about filing the FAFSA over the course of the next several months. There is also a mobile application, which may work okay on your iPad. I'm not sure how convenient it is on a smaller device, but if you don't have access to a computer, certainly the mobile app will be helpful. And what happens is, this is an application that the student is completing. It requires some parent information, but you always want to start with the understanding that this is the student's application. So once the application is completed, it is basically electronically signed by both the student and the parent. So one of the things that you can do right now to start is by getting an ID and creating the FSA ID so that you can sign the application, as you complete it. And both the student and the parent need this FSA ID. Only one parent has to have an FSA ID, but certainly, if you want, both can receive one. Another great feature of the FAFSA. So the FAFSA, filling it out online is the best way to go. It will, there is logic that will help you from making common errors. And so really doing it online helps. The other great feature is that the FAFSA asks for income information. And so you can download your latest income information directly from the IRS. So what's great about that is you don't need to worry about, well, what line number do I need to put, what number on from what line number. So you can just download your what is going to be asked for is the 2020 income tax figures. So you should have already filed your 2020 tax return, hopefully. And that is what makes it easy to file the FAFSA, that you already have all the numbers available. Certainly things could be changing in 2021, and there's a whole process for sharing with us as financial aid folks that change if that is your situation. But there are great webinars, another resource for MEFA, if you'd like to walk through the FAFSA. Now, the whole financial aid application process for need-based financial aid is an annual process. So you will complete the FAFSA each year. I promise it'll get easier from year to year and from child to child. But when you start the application, I think we'll jump into kind of what's reported on the FAFSA. You're going to start with basic information. So again, we're starting with the student. We're starting with the student's citizenship status and the families. If parents happen to not be citizens, then they can just put zeros if Social Security numbers are not available. And if you need to print and sign the FAFSA in paper, you can do that. Also, the FAFSA needs to know, where do you want this information sent? So you can list up to 10 colleges and universities, and then each one will get the information that you report on the form. So you're only filling it out once, and it will get sent to those schools. If the student happens to be applying to more than 10 schools, you can swap one out for another after it's processed. So then in terms of the demographic information, there'll be information about the student's household, information about the parents, who are the parents. And in the case of the FAFSA, the parents are individuals who are the custodial parent of the student and their spouse. And all parents, who live together, whether they're married or not. In the case of divorced and separated parents, it's just the custodial parent. So at this point, the household in which the child lives would be the custodial parent. And then if that parent is currently married, their current spouse, that information will also be included. If the student happens to be in legal guardianship, the legal guardians are not considered a parent for the purpose of the FAFSA. It is still possible that an institution will want to have some information about the guardian, but you'll have to take that on a case-by-case basis. And then having the household information, what's the household size and what's the number in college. So I will just pause briefly here to say that the FAFSA is in the process of being simplified and changed in coming years. So this is all information about the application year for 2022-23 academic year. Once we get into the 24-25 academic year, then the application process and criteria are going to be a little bit different. So that is going to happen while your child is in school. But once you get started, you'll be fine going forward in terms of how to complete the information. The next thing that's on the FAFSA is financial information, both the parent and the student. So it's going to start with the student. So what's important is you always have to be thinking about the mindset. This is the student's application. So just be careful that you're not putting your income information on behalf of the student, because that will make a pretty big difference in terms of the eligibility. So all the questions at the beginning really are about the student. And there you are the supplement to that. But income information is both taxable income and untaxed information. So I did mention that the income year that's being used is the 2020 income year. The FAFSA will also ask information about assets, and those assets include savings, checking, investment, other real estate property, 529 accounts that were set up by a parent are considered a parent asset. So that's to your advantage. Yes, the student may be the beneficiary of a 529, but if the parent set it up, it will stay as an asset of the parent. In the rare case that a student set up their own 529, then that is a student asset. If another common question, if a grandparent or an aunt and uncle or any other relative outside of the household set up a 529 plan, that is not reported on the FAFSA at all because it is not considered a student asset and it's not, in that case, considered a parent asset. The other thing that's not included on the FAFSA is the primary home. So if you have other real estate, that is considered. But if the home that you're living in, you will not be reporting any information about a home that you live in and own. You will not be reporting any information about the value of specific retirement accounts. You won't be reporting life insurance. And right now you will not be reporting the value of a small family business. So if you feel yourself, if those figures are coming into your brain in terms of the FAFSA, really look at the question carefully to make sure that you're answering it the way it was intended. Generally speaking, debt, so consumer debt is also not reported on the FAFSA. And the exception to that would be debt on the other real estate would be considered. Now, here's where we're going to shift gears a little bit. The FAFSA is an important application for determining eligibility for federal funds. And the federal grants, typically the most common federal grants are the federal Pell Grant, and then there's a supplemental education grant that institutions get an allocation. Most institutions get an allocation and distribute to students. But those federal dollars are really targeted to the neediest, lowest income families. But college is expensive, and families of a wide variety of financial means need help in paying for college. So those federal resources, go so far. The federal loans available to all students. But as I said at the beginning, institutions also are trying to create access for students and make sure that students are able to get a higher education. And so institutions have their own funds. And so private institutions that have considerable resource to allocate may use the College Board's CSS Profile application. And you can find this application by going to cssprofile.org or by going to the school's website and clicking on the links that they offer for the application requirements. The commonality between the FAFSA and the profile is that you only have to fill it out once, and it will be sent to all the institutions that require it. This application is not free. There is a cost to this application, but some very recent, really good news is that there are students that will qualify for a fee waiver. So families that are living in the US and have income that's less than $100,000 will be able to qualify for a fee waiver to all the schools. This is incredibly good news. It is an incredible partnership between the financial aid community and the College Board in making sure that education is accessible to students and reduces barriers. So this application also becomes available on October 1st. So you don't have to do them both on the same day, but it is good to do these two applications together if you need to fill them both out. And doing them together, just make sure that you're putting the same numbers respectively for the same general answers so that it doesn't create a conflict when financial aid folks are looking at your information. What is different about the profile is that both parents of a student, regardless of whether they're married to each other, will need to submit information on the CSS profile. So, that we call sometimes that parent is the non-custodial parent, but they will also fill out the profile. We always recommend that you start the application with the custodial parent because by listing the schools on the profile about where you want to send it, that will then tell you if that particular school is asking or needing information from that non-custodial parent. So, go through that process and see, you will be notified if you need information from the non-custodial parent. There's also another resource and recording on the MEFA website and events about specifically the profile application. So the profile is not required from all colleges and universities. It is about 400 colleges and universities across the US. A lot of them are on the Northeast and East Coast, but they're certainly throughout the United States as well. So after you apply, basically colleges and universities will receive this information electronically. In terms of the FAFSA, what you receive back as confirmation of what you filed is the student aid report. And it's really important to look at this information and make sure that no mistakes were made, that all the numbers are numbers that you recognize, that are accurate. And you will, if you file electronically, you'll and provide an email address, you'll usually receive it back via email. You can always access it as well on the Federal Student Aid website. Now, as you're filling out the profile, one of the profile advantages is that there are opportunities as you go through the profile to indicate and comment on special circumstances. Special things that are specific to your family. With the FAFSA, there's not the opportunity to note those special circumstances. So if you do have special circumstances and you're not filling out the profile, I would recommend, writing a letter and something that you can then email or mail to colleges directly. Now, the FAFSA is the first step, but there is a secondary piece of the FAFSA. It's called the federal verification process. And so schools are required to verify the accuracy and the completeness of a percentage and a portion of their applicants. So if you get selected for the federal verification process, it's not that big a deal, but it does mean that you need to follow up with a few additional pieces of information. So, it's good always to check the college's portals and make sure that if any additional information is needed, that you're able to follow up on that. So that could be a copy of a tax return. It could be a worksheet that lists your household members, but just pay attention to information coming from the school about what is required, because you want to make sure that the application is considered complete and the financial aid is accurate. So I guess I jumped the gun on that verification piece, but this is a requirement for financial aid offices, and we do need to comply. So I do understand it could feel a little bit invasive, but it's sort of just a quality control to make sure that we're doing our job and that families are understanding the process accurately. And usually colleges, in terms of that correspondence, most colleges and universities are sending these requests by email or through the portal, but at least the email is out to the student, and it usually is going to the student. So I always recommend that either you're having a conversation with the student about paying attention to those communications, or another alternative is to set up an email account that is sort of a family email account. And that email you use for financial aid, and it's one that you're checking as well as they're checking, so that you don't miss any communications which are important and timely. Now, we definitely want to work with you, and you certainly want to have contact with your financial aid office and the financial aid administrators. You know, we work in higher ed because we love the contacts and the connections that we get to have with students and with you. So what you want to learn about is what is the renewability criteria. So I mentioned that you're going to complete the renewal process annually, but what are the kinds of things that may change eligibility from year to year? The most common reason for a change in eligibility today is a change in the number in college. Income probably follows second to that, in changes in income, and then after that, maybe, you know, changes in assets. So if you anticipate that, you know, over the course of the student's enrollment, you are going to have any changes in, you know, your children attending college in or out, if you anticipate any, you know, kind of greater than standard increases or decreases in income or any other kind of asset changes, you want to be reaching out as early as possible to the financial aid office just to kind of talk it through and find out what information will they need, and how can you kind of forecast and prepare for those changes. You can also ask colleges and universities, how are the 24-25 FAFSA changes going to affect the financial aid? Now, don't be surprised if you don't hear complete answers right now. You know, we're all still trying to figure out these changes. We're trying to learn, we're trying to budget, we're trying to figure out what the, you know, impact is going to be on institutional dollars, but at least you want to know what's the approach of that institution. You know, what are they going to try to do to keep students enrolled and having something that can be consistently relied upon in terms of their financial aid expectations. Again, you know, this is not, it is formulaic, but it's not, you know, carved in stone. So when you have special circumstances, or if things change, you should know that you can always speak to someone. You can always, you know, appeal. You want to know, how do you appeal? Do you write a letter? Do you provide documentation? Those things are always good. As much reasonable detail as possible is good. We don't need a book, but we do need to know a little bit more than, I just need more money. So if you could tell us, you know, kind of what you were thinking, what you've planned for, and why it is that the cost is prohibitive, then we'll try to respond to that as much as possible. Now, how do you contact the financial aid office? That's going to be specific to each institution. Certainly phone calls during business hours, emails outside of business hours and during business hours. And some institutions are starting to offer chat that may be appealing to you, that may not be appealing to you. What's important to us is that we're offering as many options as possible in terms of ways to access us in ways that is comfortable for you and meets your timeline. So how are decisions made? Now, the first thing that's important to know about the starting of this eligibility process is, what is the cost of attendance? So you, I'm sure, are familiar with the figures related to billed tuition and fees and room and board, which would also be meals and housing. And you probably have thought about the fact, oh yeah, we're going to need some books. But also in that cost of attendance, what does it take for a student to receive and be a student for one academic year? So students obviously will need some supplies. They will need to travel sometimes to the institution, depending on how far the institution is away from your home. So there are costs associated with that transportation, and there are personal expenses that students will have. All of that together is the total cost of attendance. And you should be able to get this total cost of attendance from a college's website. You know, you should always be able to find it on their website. What's the total cost? Generally speaking, you know, I see books and supplies. Those actually seem to be coming down for students because of rental and other, you know, Amazon options. But I would say $1,000 or less Transportation obviously varies widely across the nation, and personal expenses, I'd probably say between $2,000 and $3,000 is probably an average across the board. And then the kind of the calculation, so that family, all that information that you put on the FAFSA or the profile, we're going to use those details to calculate a family contribution. So it's unfortunately not a voluntary contribution or calculation, but it is, again, it's a formula. So for the FAFSA, it's a federal formula is used, and that is congressionally approved. So there's some limited latitude that a financial aid administrator would have in how to apply that formula. But the schools that use the profile may also use an institutional methodology. And that institutional methodology, has different flavors. So typically, depending on the resources or level of resources of an institution, will determine kind of how robust that institutional methodology can be. Can it be more generous? Does it need to be less generous because resources are limited? But what is important, so that institutional family contribution and formula, that can vary from college to college, but it should be consistent at that college in terms of the students that they are considering. They should be applying that institutional methodology consistently. Now, there certainly could be professional judgments because families are different and do have special circumstances, but the approach should be consistent. And the idea here is that the family, as the student is the primary beneficiary, the family has the first responsibility to pay for the cost of higher education. Then beyond what they are capable of contributing is where the financial aid will come into play. So presently, if a family has more than one child in college, that family contribution is adjusted. There are many places where you can get an EFC calculator. If you have no idea what your family contribution might be, it's a good idea to check out some of these calculators. Some of these calculators can be fairly short in what they ask for, and some of them can be fairly in-depth. Basically, the less questions you answer, sort of the broader it will be in terms of how precise it is. The more questions you answer on these calculators, the likelihood that it can be considered more precise. But that's all how much you want it and are able to invest in that. There are a few things like My Intuition, which is a group of schools that have partnered with this tool, My Intuition, which is MYINTUITION. And those schools, those are 6 questions. So those are short formulas that would give you some information about that particular school. But I digress, and I have a habit of doing that. So stay back on track. So we look at the formula, the financial aid eligibility is that total cost of attendance minus the calculated family contribution. And that financial aid eligibility is what you are looking to meet with financial aid from all sources. So now let me show you how this is going to work from the school's perspective. So let's just say that the cost of attendance is $45,000. And again, this is for 1 year. That family contribution is the first thing that's going to go into this bucket or total cost of attendance. And that's always the family's primary responsibility. And then the colleges, in terms of filling the financial aid eligibility, are going to do this according to their own resources and ability and philosophy. So maybe grants and scholarships would go in next. Maybe then they'll add some student loan. Maybe they'll add some work study. And then the idea would be, a school that meets full need, all of those first, 4 items, the EFC, the grant, the loan, and the work, would fill the barrel. But most institutions can't meet full need. So if there are 4,500 institutions across the US at all levels, maybe about 70 to 80 of them claim to meet full need. You certainly can get a list of those institutions by Googling colleges that meet full need, but most don't. So what happens is the gap or the unmet need portion plus the family contribution is really what it's going to cost you and your family in terms of that college's expense. So that is, that's going to be the total responsibility. So how can you kind of figure out what might, again, in conjunction with that EFC calculator, every college and university is required on their website, if they use and award federal funds, to offer a net price calculator. So this is an online tool. It's on every single college's website, and it's generally supposed to be specific to that school. The net price is that total cost, so the barrel, minus the free money. So minus grants and scholarships. The difference between the whole barrel plus the amount that's free is generally what you're going to be responsible for. Whether you're responsible for it today or you're responsible for it in the future in terms of loans, that's still the whole family share. And that is the way that you can measure sort of what your total investment is at each institution across a period of time. These net price calculators, they do vary from institution to institution. Some of them, again, are fairly quick and they ask a few questions, and some are longer in nature. But some of them will display the federal and the institutional aid. Merit aid may be included if they ask some academic questions. So I would encourage you to pick, one or two of your child's top choices and just start to go look at that. Another thing you can do in that, when you're organizing your information, is do the net price calculator for each institution and start to kind of plug in what it said would be your share, and then compare that when the financial aid offers come. Now, as you get into the financial aid offers and receiving this information, they're all going to vary, unfortunately. And so you want to, be knowledgeable in approaching that. So if you've got 3 different colleges, if your eligibility is, $40,000, the grants and scholarships, it's possible that the amounts that schools offer are going to be different. And what that means is that it may cost a different amount from one college to the other. At some schools, it may just be your family contribution. And at other schools, it may be a whole lot more than the family contribution. The other thing at institutions that's important to be aware of is you've got to look at more than just the bottom line. So it's possible that if these are 3 different colleges, it's possible that their financial aid letter could total the same for the same, for one student. It could be the same award, but the components of the awards could really vary. So you need to pay attention to what is that grant and scholarship money, what's that free money versus what's the loans versus what's the work, so that really your responsibility. Hopefully most institutions are not including parent loans in the financial aid award letters, but it's really important to know that some do. Those parent loans are not guaranteed. Yes, they might be showing there so that they can demonstrate that you can meet their total cost, but it means that you need to be willing to apply. You need to be approved for that loan, and you need to have the capability to repay that loan. And again, think about this as one of 4 years, or sometimes 5 years. So we have reached the paying for college, and just as I thought, we're getting close to the hour, and I want to make sure that we hit some of your questions, and I'm going to ask Julie to call them out. One thing that I am going to do is I'm going to go back to the barrel, because what I didn't point out, and is always a good first question, is what happens with outside scholarships. I mentioned at the beginning that outside agencies are one of the sources of financial aid, but I didn't show it here. So outside scholarships are going to come into this barrel and they're going to replace something. You can't overfill the barrel with financial aid. So they may replace that unmet need, which is great. You get a $5,000 scholarship and all of a sudden the need is met and you just have to pay, $5,000 in this particular example. But it's also possible that that outside scholarship is going to replace the work study or it's going to replace the loan. In some cases, it may actually replace the grant or the scholarship. So you need to be really clear on what happens with an outside scholarship so that you are sort of adjusting your mindset and expectations as that information rolls in. So Julie, what's a question that we should tackle first?
Yes. Okay. We have a lot of questions. We have a really great group and a really engaged group. So I've been trying to answer some on the side, but all right, here we go.
Well, that's good. Maybe it means I didn't put everybody to sleep yet. So.
Yes, no, I not at all. And people are helping each other out, sending links and things. It's good. It's great. Okay. So I'll give this one. How do you deal with a non-custodial parent who can't or won't cooperate with the CSS application process?
Thank you. Thank you for pointing out things that I skipped over. So every college and university is going to have a process by which you can, again, your special circumstances, share information about your household. So yes, the starting premise is that parents, if the school's asking for the profile, both parents have a responsibility toward the education of their child. You don't divorce your child typically. But certainly family relationships are complex and they can be strained, or they can, unfortunately, sometimes there are even more severe cases. So every single college is going to have a process by which you can ask for a parent to not be included in the process, that their information be waived. Through the profile, there is a standardized form to, again, make it easy so that you only have to fill this information out once. Again, it can feel intrusive into your family situation, and that is uncomfortable, and it can also generate some uncomfortable emotions. But if you can fill out that form and indicate why is this information not available, what is the relationship between the student and the parent. Doesn't matter what the relationship is between the parents, but it matters what is the relationship between the student and the parent. And the most important thing that we are looking for as financial aid folks is, why would it be harmful for the student to be, engaging the parent in this process? Has the parent been abusive? Has the parent abandoned the family? Those are the typical scenarios in which we would waive the information. Less typical would be the parent who just says, yeah, I just don't really want to pay. Most parents don't want to pay. So, check out that form. Some colleges will have their own criteria, and they may also ask for a third party. So that's just somebody else who can support you and the student in the information that you're providing. So that could be a clergy member, it could be a therapist, it could be a teacher, someone who kind of has some firsthand knowledge of the situation. Thank you for asking that question.
Do you want to just say a couple of words about a trust fund or a complex trust fund? How does that get included?
Yeah, so I'll go back to, the student is the primary beneficiary of their education. And if a student has a trust, education is a really important component of, what that trust should have been set up for. So it is expected that if a student has a trust that is in their name, that it's, an irrevocable trust, and they're a beneficiary of that trust, that a portion of those proceeds will be used toward their education. And that can be, depending on the institution and their methodology, that can be about 20 to 25% of the value of that trust each year.
Okay. I'm gonna go up and find the next. I guess this is just talking about, we have a number of these questions, so I'll ask this one. Can you just talk a little bit about the home and the debt on the home and mortgage, maybe home equity loans, all of
Yeah.
that, how all
Yeah.
that.
So just remember the home is information that will be provided only on the profile. So if you are completing the profile, then yes, you will report the fair market value of the home and the fair market debt or the total debt. So that debt will include the primary mortgage as well as, you know, any secondary mortgage or home equity loan, not line of credit, but a home equity loan. It's also helpful to know that in some cases, in terms of talking about that institutional methodology, some institutions that have a lot of resources may be able, if the equity in your home is significant and is really above and beyond relative comparison to your income, then some institutions may limit how much of that equity is considered. So a very, very common misconception is that, oh my word, I have to report my home. They expect me to sell my home to pay for college. That is not at all what the expectation is. But when we are trying to decide how we allocate finite resources, we have to have some measure and mechanism to determine the financial health and long-term health of a family. And there is a distinction between a family that long-term has equity in a home versus a family that has no equity. And of course, everything in between. So there is, a philosophy that is a relevant piece of information and should be considered. But it does not mean that you need to sell your home. It just means when we're allocating out the financial aid dollars, that is going to be one of many criteria. The other thing I'd like to point out, and I didn't get into this, dramatically or deeply in the terms of that formula, but the portion of the family contribution that is directly attributable to those assets is a small percentage. So the formula itself is income driven, meaning the more income you have, the higher contribution you have. And assets also play into that, but it's a really small percentage. So you could have $100 or $200 or $300,000 of equity in your home, and it still may have a modest impact. Let's say in the range of about 5% on your family contribution. So I do think families place a whole lot more emphasis on this whole home equity piece than maybe they need to.
And Gail, does Amherst College have merit scholarships?
That's a great question. Amherst College is a school that meets 100% of full demonstrated need, and we do so completely with need-based funds. So Amherst College does not have any merit resources. We think all of our students that are admitted are meritorious, but we have decided that our first and foremost priority is to really help families based on their financial circumstances. Now, that being said, at Amherst, the cost is significant, and families do qualify for need-based financial aid, usually upwards of, more than $200,000. And if you have multiple students in college, it could be even higher than that. So depending on family circumstances, students are receiving financial aid at high levels. About 57% of our 1,800 students are receiving something from the college in terms of grant money. And when we meet that need at Amherst, we're not including student loans. So in this bucket, the family contribution would be there, and then the rest all the way up to the top is grant and scholarship and a modest work study amount. Enough about me. How about you?
You know what, Gail, since it's 7:30, I think you're willing to stay for a little while longer, right, and answer some more questions. But why don't we let's go to the last slide in case people have to leave within the hour, and I just want to tell them how they can follow up with us. And we're going to send this presentation. You'll see all these free resources. And the final slide, I think this is how you can connect with us on social media. And here's our telephone number and our email. And you know, one of the things that I've been typing into the chat is that yes, when you're doing your FAFSA and you're doing your CSS profile, you can save it as you go along. And then if you have questions, feel free to call MEFA. And just know that we have more webinars, you know, throughout the rest of the fall. You can always go back to mefa.org/events, and we definitely are here to help you with everything. So I just wanted to say that in case you need to leave, but fortunately Gail is willing to stay around for a little while longer and answer some more questions. So we'll keep going on that. Okay, this I think brings up I hear this a lot, so it brings up some questions that people have. Is it true that applicants who apply early action, early decision receive more aid than regular decision applicants?
Yeah, so this is gonna, it's a good question. And it really speaks to institutional priorities. And I'll say philosophies. I would like to answer sort of exclusively that no, everybody receives the same amount of aid. What I will say is that, in terms of institutions that are awarding need-based financial aid, it should be the same, because your calculation of need should be the same regardless of what path application you are applying. In terms of merit, that actually happens both ways, because sometimes people will say, well, you can give less merit because early decision is already intent on coming. But sometimes, they would get more. So there's not really one answer to that. And I think that's certainly a question that you can ask as you're visiting colleges.
That's great. Here are some more specific questions. So can I include a graduate student in the number of children in college on the FAFSA?
Yeah, so for federal purposes, a graduate student is considered independent. And so if, typically a graduate student at many institutions will not be considered. If you're supporting that child for federal purposes, they can count in the household, and for institutional purposes, maybe they would be counted in the household. But, and for federal purposes, they are included today in the number in college, but typically not.
Thanks. All right. Can you address what email address should families use on the FAFSA and CSS profile? The students or a family email address?
I say the one that you're going to answer. I will tell you that my personal story, I have a sophomore in college, and I found out because my child did not check email that months down or a month later after she applied to colleges, she's like, oh, I got this email about a free application waiver. I'm like, awesome. So you owe me $60 because you just wasted a fee waiver. So it's really important that students are checking their email, but I know that they check texts more than they check email. So whatever one's going to be answered. The FAFSA does ask for parent email addresses, I believe. And also on the profile, you have the opportunity to put a student email address and parent email addresses as well, and parent phone numbers.
And we just got a question about citizenship. I think you mentioned that at the beginning. Does a student's citizenship matter in eligibility? So maybe you could just talk a little bit about that again. Yeah.
Yes. So in terms of federal eligibility, students must be a U.S. citizen or an eligible permanent resident. So that's permanent resident, green card holders, some versions of a temporary resident, but that's there are, non-eligible statuses that would not qualify for federal student aid. But I want to be really clear, there are a lot of institutions that will award those students institutional funds. And the institutional funds could be just as generous as anybody else. So please, do not exclude or discourage any student who's not eligible for federal aid from seeking and finding the institutions that still want to provide them the resources to make an education possible.
And do federal loan dollars get paid directly to the student, and can they be used for general spending or specific to tuition, fees, or other?
That's a great question. It is a student loan. So it's important that the student does understand that they are borrowing money that they are responsible to repay. No one's going to come after you as parents to repay that loan. The process does ask for references on the master promissory note, but that's just for, contacting the student. So that's what's important, is the student is totally responsible. It's their credit that is being impacted by federal student loans. That being said, so student loans can be used to fund any portion of the cost of attendance that's not already covered by financial aid. So it can be used to cover personal expenses. It can be used to cover the family contribution. And if the bill is paid, institutions are going to give that money directly to the student. Now, I also want to take this opportunity to say that there's another federal resource called the federal parent loan. That's called the PLUS loan. In the PLUS loan, the parent is the borrower. And that loan, you as the parent get to decide if any credit should be refunded to you or should be refunded to the student. In the application process, you make that choice. So in that case, you can be sure that if you're borrowing the money and you're responsible for the money, any excess is coming back to you. And the thing about loans, I feel like everybody gets really worked up about the amounts. During the enrollment period, you have complete flexibility to alter the amount, to reduce the amount, to cancel it. So speaking with a financial aid person about what are your goals, what are you trying to do? Are you trying just to cover the bill? Are you trying to cover some other expenses? Are you trying to limit borrowing? Can you get a work study job to limit how much you have to borrow? We're always happy to talk with students about, what are your goals in financing this education, and how can we provide information that will help you achieve those goals?
I think you did talk about this, Gail, but I know this ends up being a large question, so maybe we can even show the barrel again. Who determines, what an outside scholarship replaces in the barrel? And can, awards be changed? And is it different depending on which school the child chooses?
Yeah, this is important. It's the school's choice. Now, the scholarship agency, they can say, we don't want you to take our money if you're going to reduce your scholarship. And some scholarship agencies do say that. And Amherst, our Amherst policy is that because we've already filled that barrel with grant and scholarship and work study, we will first replace the work study. But if you get a scholarship that's more than the work study, then we're reducing the Amherst money. And so some scholarship agencies will say, we want that money back, and that's fine, we'll give it back. But what is important to know is that the intent of that scholarship money is not, it is not intended to replace the parent contribution. Some institutions will allow it to replace the student portion of the contribution. Some institutions will not. But that's why you need to ask that question as you're visiting and considering schools.
Right. Can you talk a little bit? I think this is not very common, but I guess we might as well have it answered here. That this person has a husband who works at a college and is going to receive some tuition reimbursement because of that. Can you just maybe say a few things about how that works?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'll say is you want to report that up front because you don't want any surprises. So sometimes those amounts can vary based on the institution. So just report what is likely to be received at outside institutions or the majority of the institutions. And I would say most schools probably treat that money the same way as the outside scholarship. Although I think some schools replace the grant dollar for dollar. So again, I would ask about the treatment for tuition benefits.
And can you just also talk about private high schools, parents paying for private high schools? Could that
Yeah, so I will say that that's one of the advantages to the profile application. People think that the profile application is long and tedious, and if you have a complex, detailed family financial story, then yeah, it is complex. But it also asks about amounts that you're paying to secondary school, and some institutions, Amherst among them, wants to be able to consider as many resources as possible for families. And if you've got that as an expense, we will take that into consideration, and other institutions may as well. And that may be factored into the calculation of the family contribution, ultimately, keeping it lower or reducing it a little bit from what it might be at another institution. Now, not every institution is privileged enough to have enough resources to be able to do that. But that's one of the reasons that I think for middle income families, I think the profile is actually a helpful tool.
All right, I'm just going to look at the time here. I think we still have a lot of questions here. I think I'm just going to ask a couple more, and then I'm just going to encourage anyone whose question was not answered to make sure you send that along to MEFA, and would be happy to take that. Let me see.
I mean, I think that this process, I think the fact that you have so many questions speak to the complexity of the process. You're not going to get this all in one night, and that's okay. Because as you talk to friends and as you talk to schools, you're going to ask more questions and you're going to get more information. Read the materials that schools provide. Come talk to us, us financial aid administrators as you're visiting colleges. When there are school visits, they should set up, offer, I should say, appointments. Take advantage of those appointments. But you're going to gain so much knowledge through this process. And if you have multiple children, it will pay off.
That's great. I'm gonna stop there and stay in touch with MEFA. Write your question in again. I'm going to be sending the recording. You can ask me a question at that point. And as Gail just said, you'll continue to learn over the next months, and if some of you are really early years. So thank you so much for such an engaged session. And Gail, thank you for answering all of those questions and presenting all of that information. And people seem very happy that it was very informative. So
great. Thanks so much for joining me tonight.
All right. Good night, everyone.